So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this final session on offshore wind, port infrastructure and investment gateways to growth. My name's Clare Foster. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a project finance partner at law firm Shepherd and Wedderburn and also head of our clean energy sector. And it's my great pleasure to be your chairperson this afternoon. A few housekeeping matters before we begin, if you don't mind. Please note there are no fire alarm drills planned, and therefore should an alarm sound, please make your way to the nearest emergency exit and follow the instructions from members of the SEC team. If in doubt, follow me because I will be moving at speed. Can I remind you all, please, to put your phones and other devices on silent, but don't switch them off, please, because I'm hoping a number of you will be using Slido. And you'll be thrilled to hear that there are no slides today. The hope is that this will be an interactive discussion, so please do take the opportunity to ask questions. A microphone will be available for those who would prefer to ask their questions in the traditional way, but if you prefer to use the app, you can access Slido using the All Energy app or via www.sli.do and use the code #AllEnergy24 to join as a participant. Then select the Lomond Auditorium and you will see us magically appear on screen. So we've got a lot to cover in this session and we have assembled a terrific panel who come at this challenge from a variety of perspectives. And from speaking with them a couple of times now, it's evident that there is no single magic key which will unlock the potential of this port market. So before we begin, please allow me to make some very brief introductions. Biographies are on the All Energy website if you're looking for the dirt on any of us. But I am delighted to welcome Alistair McIntosh, Programme Director of the Green Free Ports at Scottish Government, Lewis Gillies, CEO of Haventus, Colin Hudson, Managing Director of Banking and Investments at UKIB, Derek McGlashan, Director of Saltire Sustainability Limited, and last but by no means least, Rosa Rotko, Energy Transformation Specialist at Mott MacDonald. The plan this afternoon is for me to set the scene and then invite each of our panellists up to the lectern to give their introductory remarks. And we'll then move into the Q&A session when you'll have the opportunity to ask not whatever you like, hopefully it'll be port related, but hopefully some interesting questions that will challenge all of us. So if I can take a moment to set the scene for you, there's some big numbers quoted when we talk about offshore wind. The ambition that was set out in the British Energy Security Strategy was to deploy 50 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030, with 5 of those gigawatts coming from floating wind. Now, the ScotWind round resulted in option to lease agreements with Crown Estate Scotland for 20 projects. That alone gave a combined potential capacity of 27.6 gigawatts. And in short order thereafter, because I know because I was involved in it, there were then an additional 12 INTOG projects which signed exclusivity agreements with Crown Estate. These are really impressive numbers when you think about the targets that were set, but it's on paper. It is a potential pipeline. And to get to the stage of turbines offshore and generating, a lot needs to happen. Critical to delivery of our offshore ambitions is port infrastructure. But even though there have been some brilliant deals, at which point I look to my panel, one of which was announced this week at Ardisir, there simply isn't enough activity in the market at the moment. And unlike some other jurisdictions, the UK doesn't appear to be investing in our port infrastructure ahead of need or to the level required. The risk of not doing so is catastrophic. Put starkly, it puts in jeopardy delivery of our offshore wind pipeline. Now, there are 11 major ports and 200 smaller ports and harbours around the Scottish coastline. But currently, there are only a handful which are going to be ready for the massive marshalling, assembly, storage and O&M capacity requirements which developers want to secure, and they want to secure it now. Add to this the different types of ports We have a mix of privately owned ports, trust ports and council ports, many of which haven't been touched for decades. Think the oil and gas era, an enormous amount of time ago. And the challenges facing each of these ports will be different, particularly in the context of investment now, years ahead of CFD award. Who bears that risk? Now, if the scale of the challenge has scared the living daylights out of you, or maybe woken you up after your very hearty lunch, then let me pause for some optimism. I'd like to think that the timing of the announcement this week regarding financial close of the new £100 million debt facility signed among Ardasir, UKIB and SNIB was deliberate, given that Lewis and Colin are both on this panel. But even I know I don't have that level of influence. Regardless, it is a fantastic good news story for the port sector and what the art of the possible actually is. And there are also some great initiatives underway. The strategic investment model announced 3 projects it selected to progress to stage 2 earlier this year. FLOWMIS also announced awards for its £160 million grant funding, and yes, Scottish Government also announced an up to £500 million commitment over 5 years to leverage private investment in ports, manufacturing and assembly work. But that's just a start. It is a veritable drop in the ocean. We need more, we need much more, and we need it now to fill that huge CapEx requirement that needs to be invested in our port infrastructure. And what's the ultimate prize? A multi-billion-pound market in its own right, an infrastructure asset class with a lifespan which will be attractive to multiple investors, both domestically and internationally, and the ability to build an enduring supply chain and to make the UK and Scotland, in particular, the destination of choice for investment. Why aren't we doing more? So we need innovation around structuring to unlock the potential. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to my panel to share their introductory remarks. If I could invite Alistair McIntosh up to the lectern, please.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to participate in a small way in All Energy and in such very good company today, both in the room and on the panel. For me personally, I'm very much looking forward to benefiting from the experience and insights of the panellists and to a practical, real-world discussion about the challenges and opportunities around ports as gateways to growth, which I was recently told was the title of a report published last year by the British Ports Association and Scotland's enterprise agencies, so a particularly astute choice of title by our hosts. As one small part of the wider, much wider policy backdrop to the conversation this afternoon, I've been asked to say just a few words about the Green Freeports programme, which is being taken forward jointly by the Scottish and UK governments on the basis of a partnership approach in support of 2 public-private consortia developing exciting and ambitious plans for green freeports in the Forth Estuary and in Inverness and Cromarty Firth. Now, the policy goals of this programme can be summarised in 3 key points. First of all, they aim to promote the creation of clusters of businesses in high productivity, strategically important sectors. Equally important, they aim to give additional impetus to Scotland's transition to net zero, both by supporting the development and deployment of clean energy technologies and through ambitious decarbonisation plans for their own operations. So that, is, if you like, is the green in Green Freeports, both in what they will do and also in how they will do it. And above all, the programme aims to attract significant new investment, create significant numbers of new, high-quality, well-paid jobs, which will embed the principles of fair work, and to help to achieve a major economic transformation in the regions in which they are situated. Now, to help the consortia achieve those goals, the two governments are providing a range of targeted financial and other support, including seed capital for enabling infrastructure, a package of both reserved and devolved tax reliefs for businesses landing, investing, growing and in taking on new employees in 6 tightly defined sites around the 2 green free ports: Nig, Cromarty, Highland Deep Haven, Inverness and Ardashir for the Inverness and Cromarty Firth Green Free Port, and Leith, Rosyth, Grangemouth and Burnt Island for the 4th Green Free Port. There will also be a package of specific customs easements, specialist support from the two governments on trade, on investment, on innovation, and a more streamlined approach to planning. So the focus of the 2 green free ports is complementary. Cromarty, of course, is focusing very, very heavily on offshore wind, both fixed and floating, for reasons which will be obvious to many in the audience. Forth, on the other hand, is also targeting alternative fuels, such as green and blue hydrogen, and advanced manufacturing, particularly shipbuilding. Together, their plans aspire to attract some 10 billion in investment and to create tens of thousands of new jobs over the coming decade. And in doing this, importantly, as the Scottish Offshore Wind Ports Alliance pointed out very helpfully just yesterday, they will create a wide range of supply chain opportunities right around the country. We're at a very early stage in the journey of green free ports. The outline business cases have only just been approved. The tax sites for Inverness and Cromarty Firth went live just last month. The sites for Forth should, God and the UK Parliament willing, come online within the next month. But we've already seen a series of announcements and major investment decisions, some of which were mentioned earlier, some of which were mentioned yesterday. Just in the last week or so, Sumitomo broke ground at Nig. Quantum and Haventus, with the backing of the Scottish National Investment Bank and UK Investment Bank, have announced major plans for Ardashir. RWE have announced plans to create a new green hydrogen facility at Grangemouth. So we are cautiously optimistic, but we are optimistic. It should finally, I think, be said that this is a programme which has got many moving parts and, in some sense, many moving partners. And the substance and process around the whole green free ports concept are both quite complex with a lot of interdependencies. So for either of our 2 green free ports to achieve their full potential, there's a lot to be done, not just by the consortia, not just by the local authorities in which they are situated, who are their key strategic enablers, but also by government and governments across sectors, across geographies and across programmes. We need to ensure alignment with a number of the policy instruments which Clare has already alluded to and which have been the source of discussion throughout the 2 days of this conference. Now, that's going to be quite some challenge for joined-up government, and the fact that different levers are in different pairs of hands, some of them in Edinburgh and some of them in London, doesn't make things any easier. But I think it's fair to say that the approach that we're taking to this programme, which could be described as Team Scotland and Team UK, working together to support public and private sector on the ground, puts us in a good position to tackle some of these interdependencies and some of these barriers, and might, just might, in this year of a UK general election, give us some teachable insights about how 2 governments might work together on complicated issues where collaboration will be the answer to success. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Clare, for that wonderful introduction earlier. Haventus is a relatively new company. We were formed last year with 300 million of financial backing from Quantum Capital from Houston, and more recently with a further 100 million backing from UK and SNIB, which we announced on Monday this week, which has been discussed many times this week, and which I'm very grateful to Colin and his team and the team from SNIB in working with us to get to the right place. That kind of financing makes accessing private equity considerably easier. And I actually believe it's a great way for the country to attract private equity here. It's a great model, that public financing leaning in behind equity, and I say behind specifically the equity. I think it makes it much easier and much more accessible. We are the owners of Ardersier port on the Murray Firth. It's just east of Inverness, and we're also a proud member of the Green Freeport that Alistair mentioned when he spoke. Ardersier has been literally a sleeping giant for the last 20 years. After 3 decades of building oil and gas rigs out from there, it has basically sat doing nothing since. We are in the process of waking up that sleeping giant. Construction is actually underway. The First Minister broke ground for us this week. We had, big disclosure, actually started work about 3 weeks ago, and it's our intent to have the facility fully operational in the summer of 25. There's probably a song in those words there. And it will be a bespoke energy transition facility purpose-built for offshore renewables. So why are we investing in Ardersier? There are 3 key reasons for it. So first of all, Europe, the UK and Scotland energy policy is basically electrifying our lives. If you look at it, everything from transport to heat is being moved towards electricity in the coming years. And therefore, that creates significant increased electricity demand, which in turn must be, supplied. And if you're going to deal with issues of climate change and energy security, frankly, you've probably only got 2 options. It's nuclear and offshore wind, and I suspect most countries will do both, but some countries will only do one. The second, so in our mind, it's not a question of if offshore wind will happen, it's really a question of when. The second reason that we're investing in Ardersier Port is the pace of development of offshore wind is very dependent on port space. I believe that the rest of the supply chain, just as it has for every other industry, will fall in place when people actually start to build out facilities. But without port space, you can't do anything. However, if we weren't doing the kind of thing we're doing, it's our view that with the current license capacity and just off the coast of Scotland here, we'd probably still be building it out at the end of this century because it's so land intensive. And the third reason that we're doing it is we're responding to the political signals from the Scottish Government and the UK Government. All that license capacity it is a process that ends up with people with licenses that they can develop. But really, it's a massive signal to the investment world to come here and invest money off the back of it. The second thing is that the regulatory bodies are thoroughly engaged and proactive. That has been our experience. And then the last piece is that what we call the 3 Cs, that's around consenting, grid connections, and CFDs, are making positive progress. So the things that need to happen are starting to happen, and that's what gives us confidence. So going back quickly to the question of why are ports so important? As I said earlier, offshore wind, and it might sound counterintuitive, is very land hungry. You need large swathes of land with a gate to the road and a gate to the sea, which the guys from the ports will call a quay. It's land hungry because the equipment that's involved is just enormous. And unlike the microchip where they get smaller and more powerful, it's highly likely that offshore wind is going to get more powerful but bigger and therefore require more land. You may also observe that we're a proud maritime nation with lots of great ports, and people say, why do we need ports? We've got lots of ports. Well, that's actually true. But most of these ports are busy doing other things. They're taking in cruise ships, they're dealing with fishing boats, they're dealing with supply boats to the oil and gas sector in the North Sea, and they're dealing with containers that bring our everyday goods that we all use. So although there is lots of port space, there is very little available port space for this, which is why we need more. So if you consider, by our estimates, you need roughly 100 acres of land to deploy 1 gigawatt, and you need that over 2 years. You can see the considerable amount of land that is required next to quays in these ports. And that's before you get to floating wind. That is even more land hungry. And that is essentially the reasons why we are and our investors are investing in Ardersier. Ardersier is also has the additional benefit of its location. Not only is it located to be part of the Green Freeport, and not only is it located proximate to Nig and to Cromarty, where if working together we can hopefully achieve some synergy across them, but all 3 of these ports are very well positioned relative to all of the licensed capacity in the North Sea. So we created Haventus just over 1 year ago. As I said, we're investing in response to the political signals, and we're basically investing on a no-regrets basis. Somebody here, we all have to take some element of risk because we're effectively deploying a technology before any other country in the world, and that's what we've agreed to do. The key agencies, such as the Scottish Government, the Highland Council, HIE, Nature Marine Scotland, SEPA, have been absolutely superb in their support, and I apologise if I missed anybody out from that list. And I would just say to finish that, I'm a very proud Highlander working with an immense team and a fabulous asset doing things to be very proud of in the Highlands. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction, Clare, and delighted to have the opportunity to say a few words about UKIB and our activities and perspectives on the UK port sector. My name is Colin Hudson. I'm a managing director in the banking and investments team in UKIB. I've been in the bank for precisely a year today. I joined from another institution, Siemens Bank, where I was responsible for the project finance team covering the UK, the Middle East, and Africa. And being Siemens, obviously, we were very active indeed in offshore wind. Some of you may not be fully aware of UKIB's activities, so I thought I'd just spend a couple of moments talking about who we are and what we get up to. We were established 3 years ago. We're Leeds-based, but we have satellite offices in Edinburgh, in Belfast, in Cardiff, and in London. We're owned by the Treasury, but we are operationally independent. But Treasury has allocated us £22 billion to support UK infrastructure. So far, we've managed to get through just over £3 billion of that, spread across just over 30 projects. So with an average ticket size, if you like, of £100 million, we do believe that we are increasingly becoming a significant aspect of the UK infrastructure funding market. We have 2 axiomatic principles which underpin our activity. What we do must take forward the government's zero carbon transition agenda, and what we do must also engender regional and local economic growth. We've got 5 core target sectors: clean energy, front and centre, the most active of those sectors, but in addition, green transportation, water, waste, and digital. We have an extremely wide product range. For me as a banker, it was very refreshing to be able to look at not just lending debt, but also guarantees, providing common equity, providing mezzanine finance, providing convertible loan notes. Basically, we are a problem-solving institution looking to take forward the government's policy with respect to infrastructure funding. And really, we look to deploy the product which best meets the need of the project. Turning to ports, well, since our inception, port finance has been a significant area of activity for the bank. We've closed 3 projects in the space so far. Most recently, and very satisfyingly, to come into the £100 million debt financing of Ardisia alongside our partner SNIB in that respect. In addition, we provided finance to Teesport and to the Port of Tyne. And in all cases, the purpose of the financing is to enable infrastructure to be put in place to support the rollout of offshore wind activity. Back in autumn of last year, we published sector strategy documents. We published a number of sector strategy documents talking about a series of sectors where we were most focused, where we anticipate being most focused going forwards. Ports was a key one of those sectors. And in those sectors, we basically identified, in particular, port infrastructure to support offshore wind and floating offshore wind as being where we would be looking to get busy. The Floating Offshore Wind Action Group has identified a funding requirement for port infrastructure of £3.45 billion in the next 5 to 10 years. That's a very significant requirement, and we are very keen to be part of that. Interestingly enough, in that document, we talked about equity as being our perceived most common tool to use in the sector, and thus far we've only deployed debt. So hopefully going forwards we can broaden our range of engagement. Again, in that sector strategy document, we talked about what the problem is that we're seeking to solve with regard to our activity in ports. And that's been touched on already by the panel and by Clare in her introductory remarks. And that is the chicken and egg issue of looking to develop port infrastructure which can take forwards and support the development of floating offshore wind and fixed bottom offshore wind at a time when the revenue certainty required by developers of projects to invest downstream in the port supply chain required to take their projects forward is unclear. And there's a gapping there, and potentially a gapping of a number of years before the port infrastructure investment which is required now will generate the infrastructure which will be utilised by offshore wind developers in a few years hence. What we are looking to do is help close that gap, working with port operators, port developers, wind farm developers, and other stakeholders. We're looking to make that gap as small as possible and to bring about the infrastructure which is required. Again, we have the range to do that. We can provide guarantees to providers of potential debt finance to port facilities. We can provide senior debt, as we have just done in Ardisia. We can provide mezzanine finance to give senior debt the cushion it needs to have the confidence to invest in projects. And we also can provide equity to put in place genuine risk capital to help absorb that period of uncertainty before the projects come online. We were delighted to work on the Ardisia transaction and bring it to close. We were delighted to work with SNIB in that regard. I think it's fair to say we're looking at a project where in time the market will crystallize from a contracting perspective, but there was that period where we as lenders had to get comfortable with the wider market story through due diligence. But I should say, from a funding perspective, even in the port sphere, that is not unusual. even in the UK context, London Gateway has raised a large amount of debt and equity financing for container ports. Other ports in Europe have similarly been able to access private sector capital. It's not unusual for funders to take that risk. It's very heartening to see an organisation like QEP perhaps showing the way here, where that risk can be absorbed in the context of a confident, wider, eventual market story. So, hoping to be busy going forwards on other port opportunities, and I'm very keen and happy to take any questions on how we can best support the market. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the warm-up from everybody else as well. You've all touched on points that I had woven into my scrawny notes that I've been making more succinct, as I was being laughed at earlier. So let's see how we get on. So Derek McGlashan, I run Saltire Sustainability, which advises on all sorts of sustainability angles for mostly infrastructure-related companies. I'm also a non-exec at Crobberty and VP at Alir Infrastructure. I've got over 25 years in ports, and many port developments have crossed my desk over these years. Lots of them didn't even reach the planning phase. They were concept where we put a line through it for whatever reason, often consenting challenges. Many of them, though, did make it to consent. Some of them got consent and are now operational, which is really heartening to see. And I've many scars that have come from going through that process. As a number of you sat in this room will know, the effort associated with the consenting process is vast, and the timescales are rarely short. The cost can be substantial, and the goalposts can move as you go through that process, which can be very frustrating if you're trying to gain that consent, and also very frustrating if you're the regulator trying to implement those changes with projects partway through the process. In many ways, building is the easy bit. And once it's built, you have the challenge of operational planning. And often, decisions that have been made at the design stage can have a real impact on the operation of your facility, and whatever that is, that's not limited to ports, clearly. Sometimes the market changes. Products change shape and scale. Components get bigger if we start to think about offshore wind and energy-related activities. Vessels get bigger. And so as you go through that process, it's important to engage with your markets so that you can try and second-guess where that's going and understand where your market thinks the direction of travel is. And in some cases, you might have to try and influence that. I've had discussions with various people over the years. I once met a chief executive with head in his hands, couldn't understand why he was in such a bad mood, and eventually he said, "My key customer has just told me that the next generation of ships can't fit in my port. They're my number one customer. What do I do?" So we had to look at an outside berth, which cost a lot of money, but secured that revenue for a period of time. Now, the vessel operator hadn't really thought about the impact on not just their contract for that port. Could there even be other ports that would fit that vessel? And we've seen some of that challenge in the container and short sea shipping market over the years, where many people will tell you that short sea shipping container vessels are going to get much, much bigger. And then you look at the ports they call that, and they can't handle vessels that are much, much bigger. So will that ever happen? Well, people build those vessels, but they just end up deployed on alternative routes. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. Those of you who know me will know that is a risk if I take the stand. Our TV schedules, those of us who still have time to watch real TV, are littered with programmes that have a historic or an archaeological element to it, where the programme will start with what on earth is this strange structure that's falling down, being reclaimed by nature at the coastline? And 9 times out of 10, there'll have been a port that was built for a key function, And it might have been coal exports, or it might have been iron ore imports, or it might be even further back than that, export of timber. Not far from here, if you go down to Inverclyde, you can still see the timber pens from all the timber that was floated down the Clyde to go for onward progression to wherever it was going to be required. And those assets, they're not used anymore. And who owns them? That's a good question. Who's maintaining them? That's a really good question. Who can afford to maintain them? That's a very difficult question. And lots of the assets that are out there today, we know who own them, and they've got a legal obligation to maintain them. And Health and Safety at Work Act and so on come into the fore. And sometimes there are some really difficult questions. You know, taking this infrastructure out costs many millions. But that's not very attractive if your asset doesn't make a lot of money to be able to sustain that removal cost, or indeed the ongoing maintenance piece. So when we go through this consenting process now, the regulations have changed, going back to my starting point, we now need to consider how we remove some of these assets. But often when it comes to ports, we talk about, well, we're never going to remove them because, you know, we're digging up the seabed, sticking a pile of rock in it, usually from Norway or the north of Scotland. Why would you take it back out again? That's a really difficult job. This is going to be land in perpetuity. So going back to what I said earlier about making sure your business case stacks up, that's all well and good if you've got a vision for the next 10 years or even 20 years for all of that land area. What are you going to do with it in 50 years? How are you going to afford the maintenance on that? So it's worth thinking through some of these slightly further ahead angles rather than just what's immediately out there to grab today, and think about what the alternative uses are, the additional uses, the added value, the add-ons that you hear about in other businesses. I was reading a post on LinkedIn this morning by an aviation person who talked about the difference in things that airlines sold 30 years ago versus today, and what's seen as core versus added extra value that you can squeeze out of your customer. So how can I start to wrap some of this up, taking the hint, Clare? Plan well ahead. Try to think about some of these challenges that are around the corner. Engage with your market and think about what else is out there. Is there a more novel way of doing this? Can you use satellite sites? Easier to consent, perhaps, than generating new port infrastructure. Perhaps cheaper than the often hundreds of millions of pound bill for building port infrastructure in the classic way. Is there a non-classic way to do it? Could you build floating infrastructure? There must be about 4 or 5 companies that are now in that space today. Can it be temporary? Can you scale it with your project so that it grows with the project you're trying to support and then shrinks as your project comes to its end? And so does that bring alternative finance options? Can you lease some of these assets? Could you think about part owning? Can you operate cooperatives? So I'll leave you with some of those thoughts, and happy to talk about any of them with any of you afterwards if you want to. I can be found through the usual business channels. And on that note, I'll hand over to Rosa.
Thank you to all my fellow panellists. That was a very educational session so far, as has been the whole conference. Yesterday, I heard something that really resonated with me. A gentleman from Ocean Winds was talking about the Moray Firth wind farm and how he's taking loads and loads of foreign delegations to look at the site. And he said these international delegations are not coming here to look at a wind farm. They're coming here to look at the enabling infrastructure, which is really the topic of this panel. What is the enabling infrastructure that the ports can provide? And I'm going to focus on energy at the port site and in the area as a key enabling infrastructure for the wider development and wider growth. So for those of you who don't know Mott MacDonald, we are a global engineering and management consultancy. We design and advise on all manner of port infrastructure as well as every type of energy infrastructure. So the question really is, how can we make ports, any particular port, attractive for investors and developers? And my thesis is that one of the key differentiators that a port or any this type of industrial cluster area can do is to ensure that there is sufficient available energy at competitive prices. And what do I mean by that? There are two limbs. One is the availability, and the other is cost. And when we talk about energy, I mean electricity, gas, hydrogen, biofuels, other low-carbon fuels, for all the uses that are required by manufacturing sites, whether they are for offshore wind components or cabling, manufacturing for many other uses, though shipbuilding was mentioned, wider ports operations, ships, fleets on ground. We all probably know of a site or more than one site where they've been told that it might take 7 years to get a grid connection. And 7 years is a very long time. And to put it in context, for example, the free ports, which currently expect to get a 10-year tax advantage, if you eat up 7 years of that for waiting for a grid connection to part of that site, it makes the proposition a lot less compelling. But even for ports who are not in the free port tax zone, it is a competition between where could a manufacturer locate themselves, and they obviously need to be able to guarantee sufficient level of energy. So if you don't have it, or if it takes 7 years, it will put you at a disadvantage. And the other key limb is cost. So attracting developers and manufacturers is a key part of the business model, and particularly for free ports, but all ports. And it's attracting international manufacturers who could locate their facility anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, in the UK, we already have very high electricity price comparative in Europe. There are only a couple of countries who've got a higher price than we do. So that's already tricky. And for some companies in manufacturing, the energy costs can be as high as 20 to 40% if it's something like steel manufacturing. But for most, it's going to be 15% anyway. So it's a key part of their OPEX, and a key decision determinator is there sufficient energy, and is it low cost enough, as well as then low carbon. And so you might ask, what can a port do, or what can an area do outside influencing national policy and national sort of subsidy mechanisms? The one key technical solution that an area can look is their own energy area master planning, and looking at microgrid solution for parts of the area, which could enable increased access and lower cost for certain uses or certain parts of the site. And in essence, it's an exercise of identifying loads, current loads, future demand at a site, and looking at how that's met, talking with the networks, identifying where there is potential for capacity upgrades and where there are constraints, and then looking at where could you site in an area, where could you site on-site renewables, battery storage, and could you connect areas with your own microgrid or private wires to influence what's available to manufacturing and others, and what impact can you have on the cost. So technically, we can get our heads around this solution. Practically, there are lots of complexities for ports to implement this, and one of the problem is that they're very multi-stakeholder clusters. So it's a lot easier for a single manufacturing company. A lot of automotive companies do this on their own sites, but when we're talking about ports, and particularly free ports, it's multiple entities, multiple landowners, tenants, users, in some cases multiple local authorities, and so it might not always be so easy in terms of coordinating, where technology is clear, but the coordination might make it a business problem. And where I see that there's a role for these type of coordinating bodies, so it could be the local authority, it could be, if it's a free port, the free port governing body. Some areas have growth boards or other cluster sort of coordinators. So I see it's these type of trusted organisations who can have a convening power and could help facilitate area energy planning and microgrids and solutions for the benefit of the wider community. And also, I think a key part of this is also facilitating the dialogue with policymakers about regulation and policy that could help unlock growth in that area. And I'm sure we touched on some of the policy levers in the discussion, but there are some relatively simple things that could be done and have been done in the past for various industrial clusters and others, where either the governments or local authorities are awarding funds to develop like industrial cluster plans or local net zero hubs or different things at different levels to enable. So I think this is also something that should be supported for ports and free ports, and if there's policymakers listening outside, Alistair, of course, then that's something I think that would be beneficial for this exercise in attracting manufacturing in certain areas and securing further investment and growth. Thank you.
So hopefully you've got a sense now of why this panel was assembled. We've got a myriad of different approaches, views, government, equity, debt, technical, alternative solutions, microgrids. There is no one single silver key to unlock all of this. I'm going to play with Slido, but whilst I do that, I'm going to exercise the discretion of the chair and ask a couple of questions, if I may. And I'm going to start with you, Alistair, if you don't mind cutting straight to the chase. Why are there only 2 green free ports?
Well, Claire, that's an extremely good question. And in fact, it's a question which, when we in the Scottish Government saw the quality of the bids and applications that came in, we asked the UK Government, can we really only have 2? At that time, the UK Government was only in a position to agree to 2. But I think there are some very serious possibilities of building on the work that the other ports and the other consortia put together, particularly in the case of one of them. And I think that if the programme delivers on its initial promise, that's a conversation that should be had between the 2 governments going forward. Of course, as I've said, we're on a very early stage in the journey, so there are lots of challenges to overcome before we can say confidently that they're delivering. But I don't think this story is completely over yet.
I agree, but my challenge to you is speed. We don't have time.
Indeed. I mean, in all of this, I think the question is, you talked about chicken and eggs, we've talked about carts and horses, we've talked about getting things in the right order. Yeah. I think there's a key point here, which is to take a sort of maritime analogy. The convoy moves at the speed of the slowest ship. And we have to put a lot of effort into ensuring that the slower ships can keep up with the rest of them. And that's particularly the case when, as I've said, you've got 2 governments, many different bits of 2 governments seeking to work together.
Thank you. Liz, turning to you, and the one thing that you said that really resonated with me, and we've had this discussion before, you've talked about you're developing Ardersier on a no-regrets basis. So my assumption is no commercial contracts in place. And what can you say to people in this room about your attitude to risk?
So in answer to your first question, that is correct. We've got no commercial contracts in place, having taken the financial investment decision. The key to enabling us to do that was to access capital that is used to taking an element of risk, which is why we've accessed capital through Quantum Energy Partners in the US. Having worked there for the last 15 years in the world of private equity, it just has a different attitude towards risk. And in fact, it's a cultural thing. I was explaining to Colin earlier, even the guy who cut my hair for the last 8 years, had ownership in 7 or 8 oil and gas wells because he had some spare cash. It's a cultural thing.
And very different, I would suggest, from the European and UK attitude to risk. I think the appetite for taking that leap of faith is entirely different in North America compared to what we do in Europe. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
That's a very fair statement in my experience.
Yeah. And Colin, what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I think the sector needs more quantums, frankly. And sometimes, people don't recognise that they're taking risk in other sectors, which is very akin to the risk associated with an opportunity like Ardisia. But because it's badged as greenfield, because it's badged as being associated with a certain sector, perhaps a sector where they're used to more contractualized revenues, they don't buy into what from our perspective at UKIB is a very compelling potential upside risk story. The size of ScotWind is enormous. There are degrees around the extent to which it will be delivered, but it will be delivered in size. And to be delivered in size, it will require port infrastructure. And that is an underwritable proposition. It's underwritable from a banking perspective, and it's underwritable from an equity perspective. And I think, as I say, you look at other sectors, whether it's, rollout of fibre, whether it's building greenfield container ports, whether it's developing and buying airports. There are lots of infrastructure sectors in the UK where infrastructure private equity, where other sponsors are prepared to take that period of uncertainty because the backdrop is so evidently compelling. And it would be perhaps good to see a bit more of that in the port infrastructure space as well.
And before we move on, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the MOU that has been signed between UKIB and SNIB. And I think Ardisia is a fabulous example of what the art of the possible is between north and south of the border working to deliver. Do you think it's fair to say that's a unique deal, or is the MOU going to unlock lots more collaboration between the two banks?
I hope it isn't a unique deal. It was a great pleasure to work on Ardisia. Great sponsors, evidently, but at the same time also the constructive problem-solving dynamic between ourselves and SNIB was really, there was a warmth in the room. And I'm very much hoping that we can continue to deploy that can-do attitude jointly for other infrastructure challenges with both policy banks, for other infrastructure challenges in the Scottish context.
Perfect, thank you. Slido's going a little bit mad, so I'm going to launch straight into the questions from the audience, if I may, and if I can just ask each of our panellists to indicate to me if they would like to volunteer an answer. So the first one is, how can Scottish ports be sure they'll get floating wind assembly work plus O&M work, rather than the units being built abroad and taken back there for the O&M aspect? Want to have a go, Lewis?
I think the simple answer is you've got to invest and provide the capacity if you want to win the business.
Yeah,
simply.
I agree with that. I think the other thing I'd say from a legal perspective and just my knowledge of the ScotWind round, you will be familiar with the supply chain development statements that were submitted as part of each of the bids about local content. And each of the developers are alive to the fact that investment needs to be here, rather than necessarily the default being going elsewhere. But it's going to need both approaches, I think.
To say, I touched on our due diligence when speaking, but it's much better. All our due diligence led us to the conclusion that it's much better to have a proximate facility. It's cheaper, it's less risky, and that was a key part of our credit story.
Perfect. Moving on to the next question, how is the Scottish Ports Alliance ensuring that when each port is being developed, There is capacity and capability in terms of the resources to do so. Now, this is in its infancy, I guess, in terms of this alliance. Does anyone have a view on that? I haven't been party to these conversations.
So I mean, I have been a party to the conversations around the creation of the Scottish Offshore Wind Ports Alliance. I mean, their first objective is to effectively promote Scotland. You know, what we've talked about often is that we see Norway coming here and promoting Norway. We see Denmark coming here and promoting Denmark. And we see both of those countries going to other parts of Europe to promote themselves. So what we need to do is actually promote Scotland, not only to our own offshore wind sector, but actually to the rest of Europe as well. Because frankly, given the pace of development here, we should have most of this infrastructure in place well ahead of the rest of Europe. So in fact, your question earlier was, you know, why won't we be supplied from other countries? It's entirely possible. If we don't build out the infrastructure, that's the only way we're going to be able to do it. And the intent of the SOPA group is basically to actually show the collective force that we have across all of these facilities.
But just to say, I very strongly agree with that. But I would also say that I think there's a challenge for the Scottish Ports Offshore Wind Ports Alliance, but also for those agencies of government whose job is to promote Scotland as a destination for investment in general, and specifically around the opportunities of offshore wind. So I think our colleagues in SDI, working with colleagues in the Department for Business and Trade in the UK government, have got a job of work to do, I think, to join up with the Alliance and with other partners to, there's a compelling proposition to sell, provided that they can all get together and sell it collectively in the most effective way.
Thank you. Derek, if I can come to you next, please. You mentioned some of the alternative solutions that don't necessarily require massive capex in terms of building out dredging and all of the constituent elements to accommodate need. Can you expand on what you're thinking about in the context of that and what the alternatives could be?
Yeah, so there are a number of organisations now starting to look at the concept of floating structures that could be anchored in slightly deeper water, probably still in a harbour authority area so that there's the appropriate control of navigation jurisdiction. And that therefore may not be owned and operated by the port. The port might grant a concession for anchoring, for example, albeit there are various ways to skin the cat. They may want to own it outright. There are, however, financing entities who are already saying, I would want to buy this and lease this to whether it's a wind farm developer or an EPC contractor or a port authority. And I'd want it to be built modular to grow with the scale of the opportunity. And then as the opportunity reduces in this location, I'd like it shrunk. And then maybe it can go somewhere else where there is another opportunity. Whether that is in offshore wind deployment or whether it's tidal or indeed something not even related to energy. And I think, you know, it's fair to say these are relatively early stage concepts, and those playing in this market are probably looking at lighter end use before committing to offshore wind to start. But there are a good number of entities, some of which are UK based, some of which are in other parts of the world, who are starting to show some credible interest in this space and therefore might be worth monitoring. And that probably suits Scotland quite well, having large sheltered bodies of water, be that on the east or west coast. There are other countries that it wouldn't suit quite so well, because I don't think any of these companies are suggesting that they build them in the middle of the North Sea. You know, we need a healthy dose of realism there, otherwise the credibility is shot. But that does open up, as we touched on, alternatives for financing that could be quite different. And I'm conscious that, you know, many of the ports that are in really good locations have a governance structure that makes it difficult for them to adopt the methods that are available to private ports. And so, again, that may be an opportunity that suits them better. Trying not to name companies as I answer.
You were under strict instructions, weren't you? Rosa, if I can come to you, you talked about microgrids and the art of the possible at some of these sites. What ideas do you think we could take from other sectors or other policy mechanisms that could be tailored in the context of ports to try and help facilitate the development of all this infrastructure?
Does this work? Yeah. Within energy and decarbonisation, there's different sort of local type mechanisms that have popped up in different contexts. So in the industrial cluster space, the UK government run a sort of industrial cluster fund where they were awarding funds for clusters to do plans and coordinate activity, and that was mainly in relation to CCUS and hydrogen, which again have the commonality that you're going to be running pipelines across multiple landowners' sites. But it's the same concept that no one company will want to do that legwork. At the local level, there have been local area energy plans, which are sort of local authority run and owned for local authorities. There's something in there that's replicable, but they are maybe a bit too high level, at a bit too wider scale to be commercially meaningful. So I would advocate a smaller footprint. So there are those type of things, and then obviously there's more innovative. I think West Midlands was attempting to create sort of energy innovation zones with a particular purpose in encouraging different energy technologies and decarbonisation sort of networks. So yeah, there's multiple kind of ways which this could be encouraged through sort of central government, Scottish government, local authorities could encourage this type of activity, but also private entities could sort of group together and take a lead on it as well.
Thank you. Just going back to Slido, there's some really interesting questions here. So probably one for a number of you to comment on. The question is, how is increasing turbine size and then foundation and lifting equipment planned for? And can ports help influence standardisation? And I think this is in the context of the myriad of options out there, and I've seen it with discussions with ports where what you're looking for is a very bespoke solution for your project, which may not be fit for purpose for someone else. Anyone want to offer a view? Derek, you're nodding, so I'm going to come to you.
I mean, you know, it's the big question, isn't it? Because human nature is you remember who you last spoke to. And so the last person you spoke to says that they need, I don't know, 50 tonnes per square metre, and you know, they need a crane that can do X, Y, or Z, and they need a marshalling area of A, B, C, and what have you. And so, you know, that sticks in someone's mind when they're trying to come up with their operational plan for the area. And then, you know, you'll attend an event like this, and someone will say, well, I need 80 tonnes per square metre, or I need 100 tonnes per square metre. And actually, some of them maybe don't actually know what it is, but we'll make the number 20% bigger than the number somebody else said, and then we're covered. And maybe you are, and maybe you're not. So there is a bit of a crystal ball here, and really that's why I advocate speaking to lots of people and learning from what worked and what didn't. And probably, if there was one thing I should have said, it should have been, if you're going through a development process, speak to people. Because people are usually happy to have a chat, and are usually happy over a coffee to say, well, all right, we could have done this bit better. And if there's one thing I could have done better, it's this. And it's these conversations, you know, they might take a few days to speak to lots of different people. It will save you months of wrangling down the line if you get a better view on what the projected path is for a sector. And it's eye-watering, the size of some of the turbines that are being worked on. And what's interesting is some of the manufacturers are slowing that pace of ambition, and others are really accelerating way beyond your wildest dreams. And it is difficult to know which is going to land ultimately. Will they all try and catch up with the folk out front, or are those that are out front going to scale back a bit down the line? And there's always someone out there who says this is the peak. Sometimes it is.
Any other views, or shall we move on? I've got quite a few. Happy to move on, okay. Another one for you, Lewis. You're in the hot seat today. What plans do large ports like Ardeshir have for post-wind farm construction boom to ensure it doesn't return to that sleeping giant status? It's back to crystal ball gazing, isn't it?
Gosh, that's a horrible question. Who asked that? I mean, it's a very true fact. I mean, Ardeshir was open for 3 decades, building out the oil and gas industry. And then the owners basically abandoned the site and left. But they left a hell of a legacy. I can't tell you how many people who worked on that site for those 3 decades have been back and are delighted to see what's happening, to see the sleeping giant come back. And one of the things that they have said to us many times is we've got to try and create a future beyond 3 decades. It's a very difficult thing to do without a crystal ball, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a facility with as much flexibility, partly to the same question that Derek just answered. Give it as much flexibility as we can so that it'll have future utility, so that it doesn't get abandoned in 30 years' time again.
Colin, did you have chats about this in terms of looking at the debt piece? I mean, obviously, the repayment schedule won't be decades and decades.
I'd like that 30-year repayment schedule.
I know. I just suddenly realised what I'd said, and I thought, that's a negotiating point that I don't think I'll get away with.
Yes, great question. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously our main credit case is predicated upon our take on the offshore wind opportunity. But again, as a policy bank, it is to a certain extent beholden upon us to look beyond that and see, is there residual risk and indeed residual opportunity which can underpin financing opportunities in general, as opposed to making this specifically about Ardeshir. So yeah, it's something you can take a view on, but we are talking about a period 15, 20 years hence. Who would have known, back in 2005, 2006, that the UK would be a leading offshore wind player deploying 15, 16, 17 megawatt turbines? Yeah. The future by its nature is unknowable, but I think what we're very pleased to be part of the financing picture for in Ardeshir, to bring it back to Ardeshir, is that it's a great piece of infrastructure which by dint of its size and by dint of its location is inherently flexible. And that flexibility does go to the credit story.
Yeah. And Alistair, can I come to you, just in the context of, you led on green free ports. How much of this ecosystem of perpetuity and making sure that it endures for decades and decades was part of the whole plan?
Well, I have to say that it was a factor in looking at the propositions and plans that came forward. But I think I would be overstating it if I said that it was a dominant factor. Obviously, we were looking at consortia whose plans had a degree of diversity, not a simple one-shot play. And if you look at the Inverness and Cromarty Firth Green Freeport, for example, you have a very different set of activities, mutually supportive, across the different sites. And as Lewis was saying, there may be scope actually to push that a little bit further in the way that the partners on the different sites actually choose to focus and specialise. But I don't think that there's an easy answer to what are we going to do with this in 20 years' time, assuming that between now and then we do actually manage to reach full potential and deliver ScotWind and ScotWind then deliver. So.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that ports are, generally speaking in the UK, and it was touched on, are a very investable asset class, because they're not just ports. they're logistics hubs, they're communication hubs, they have typically excellent energy connections. There's a much wider story if you can get it right at the outset to benefit from.
And just talking about that and major infrastructure, in its own right, completely separate from the offshore wind, it's integrally linked, particularly for today's session. But from the finance sector perspective, Colin, there's huge amounts of institutional debt out there, pension funds that are looking at these assets. I guess my challenge to you is, don't worry, I'll be kind. Could we be doing more in the financial sector to facilitate this? Because I'm thinking about the virtual cycle of you start with equity, you move into the debt that you and SNIB provide into commercial bank debt and then into pension funds. And moving along that Gantt chart, is there anything we can do to try and shorten the periods so that we're recycling capital to invest more?
Absolutely. I mean, to your point, and as you allude to, that institutional infrastructure debt market is inherently conservative. And typically they need a very well-established, generally speaking, externally rated investment grade story to really galvanize what they bring to the picture, which is very long maturity at typically a very competitive price. So bringing them into the infrastructure financing story as early as possible in the cycle brings very tangible benefits. One thing we can do at UKIB, one thing we're looking to deploy increasingly, and again more generally across the UK infrastructure space, is utilise our guarantee product. And that sort of basically substitutes project risk for UKIB risk to a significant extent, and it kind of allows institutional financiers to dip their toe into an asset class which they might otherwise consider to be too risky. And then as they get more experienced in that asset class, as they get to understand the risk dynamics, they have appetite to achieve better economics for them by letting that guarantee fall away. And so certainly at UKIB, we do have an enabling role, I think, to help accelerate that institutional capital into the port sector and into infrastructure more generally. So another challenging question. The UK is 9th ranked trading partner by value in relation to the US. We rank after Vietnam. How are we confident in attracting investment to free ports that isn't currently available? I'm looking at you, Alistair.
Well, strangely. Well, I don't think there is an easy, pat answer to that, except to say that we have the two consortia have developed some very specific and very compelling propositions, which are already attracting a huge amount of interest, both domestically and internationally. And I expect to see a lot more of that coming in the months and years ahead. As I said, we're very much at the beginning of this journey. We don't actually have the tax sites live in one of them, although, as I say, I hope that by this time next month, I'll be able to say something a little different. However, I think it's worth saying that the Green Free Ports programme can be seen just as much as a regional economic development programme as a trade programme. And I think even if you were for a moment to imagine that it didn't have a trade component, it would still be a pretty compelling sell in terms of the impact it can be expected to have on the regional economy. So we will see. It's always best to under-promise and over-deliver, but I think we have grounds for some cautious optimism.
Excellent. Rosa, can I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this. So the question was, how do we ensure the free ports attract the investment? And obviously, you have to do something to make yourself attractive. And Alistair mentioned a lot of the things, but I wanted to highlight a couple of other things. So So planning, which is a pain for everyone, and I know for sure, say the Highland Council has been very proactive about planning to make sure the cable factories go off the ground quickly, and it's a conscious thinking. We want to be attractive, so we have to get our act together, and I think that could be a real selling point because it's a problem. The other thing, which I throw out there because that would be really cool, would be to see some form of sort of energy skills attraction sort of mechanism, and some of other industries like nuclear communities in Cumbria obviously rely on global talent base to come in and work. So there's all manner of things how you attract people with specialist skills to come and work in an area where would you really know to go there, and so something cool in that space could really be quite powerful as well.
If I could just come back in just to sort of underline the point about the strategic support of the local authorities, and we're putting in place a planning protocol between the Green Freeports and the local authorities and the statutory agencies, precisely to give confidence that the relevant processes will be streamlined for the two Green Freeports. Highland, as you say, is particularly enthusiastic at looking at the possibility of introducing a master plan consent area approach once that legislation comes online, and there's a consultation which is, I think, closing shortly on how that might then be enacted. So that's part of the business of giving confidence of the strategic support of the public sector partners in these locations. So too is the skills story, and both Green Freeports have got a very strong story to tell about how they will ensure that they invest in sustainable skills development in different ways, and in the two Green Freeports there are slightly different approaches being taken to it, but there is a wraparound story to tell, which I think gives a bit of confidence and a bit of clarity about the alignment of public and private behind the initiative, which I think is in itself quite an attractive proposition.
Very quick one for you, if you don't mind, Alistair. When does the clock start ticking on the 10-year tax break?
2024.
There we go. Binary answer.
Short.
A few more to get through, if you'll bear with us. Will Scottish ports be set up to be able to eventually decommission assets, reuse and/or recycle component parts, including turbine blades? I guess the answer is for some of them, yes, but Lewis, do you have a view on whether that's part of the plan?
I haven't really thought towards decommissioning them yet.
I love the optimism in the room. We've built it all already.
I mean, when you take these things back out of the water, whether it's to service them or to take them out of service, you're going to need exactly what you need to put them in there. Large ports with lots of available space, with, lifting capability, and there's every opportunity to do that with the port developments that are being planned at the moment.
Thank you for that. And Derek, I'm conscious that you've got a number of hats, one of which is Port of Cromarty Firth. Do you have any views on that question, just from the Cromarty perspective?
Well, I think actually today there's a meeting taking place on decommissioning offshore wind structures in London. So there are people looking at that, and there are facilities that have been focusing on decommissioning oil and gas. And I would be very surprised if they don't make a pivot towards decommissioning other large marine structures as time moves on, given the oil and gas decommissioning market will shrink. But as Lewis said, if your facility is suitable as a construction port for offshore wind or wave and tidal or whatever energy mechanism that's out in the wet bit that you're interested in, then the chances are it could also be useful for decommissioning, should it still be available.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Alistair. Could you say something about the way that rates relief will work in the free ports and how local authorities won't be left out of pocket?
How long have you got?
Yeah.
The short answer is that the local authorities will be able to grant a discretionary relief on non-domestic rates within the tax sites within the Green Freeport. The Scottish Government will ensure that the local authority not only does not lose out as a consequence, but is actually compensated for the cost of the income foregone through the kind of local government finance mechanism, which is ferociously complicated, and I suspect we don't have time to go into it in detail here, but if anybody wants a more substantial explanation, they should nobble me on the way out, and I will be happy to put them in touch with our local government taxation colleagues.
You may want to clarify nobbled. Gently tapped in the arm for a word. Okay. The other question that's been asked here is, would there be benefit in streamlining the number of public sector port funding streams and the agencies involved? And this is a conversation I've had a lot over the last year or so, where there's a myriad of different devolved agencies and teams all overlapping. And you said something really interesting, Lewis, because you said that everyone's been super supportive and helped to facilitate everything you're trying to do at Ardis here. But do you think there's merit, and I had this conversation with someone about when an international player is looking at jurisdictions, having that team, meeting them at the airport to go, come with us, this is how it's going to work, and just streamline everything?
I mean, it's a really good question. So on the consenting side of things, I haven't experienced, or if the team has, I'm not aware of them having experienced overlap. You know, what I'm aware of is that they've been dealing with the various agencies, and everybody's been pretty clear on the roles and objectives, so no overlap there. I think the opportunity to work really cleverly together, and it's sort of a follow-on from, you know, the activities of the Offshore Wind Alliance, you know, is how do we collectively present ourselves to potential further inward investors? So, for example, if a manufacturer comes into the country via SDI out of Asia, for example, how do we all present ourselves? You know, they turn up, they're looking for port space, they're looking for government help, potentially financially. But the two things that we hear most often are, you know, what Rosa referred to there is, you know, your planning sounds very complex, and where are we going to get people? So anything we can do around those two things is really going to help any potential inward investor here. And to your point earlier, I'm not sure being ninth is that bad.
Voice of optimism. Anyone else want to proffer a view?
Just to say that on the specific issue of promotion, it's worth saying that SDI and GBT are joined at the hip in terms of a team Green Freeport approach to promoting the Green Freeports and overseas markets. In the same way, there is a kind of a Team Scotland, Team UKIB approach to joining the dots within the two governments. Whether or not that would be easier with structural change, interesting question, but we have structures in place internally and also with the two Green Freeports to ensure that as far as possible they don't have to have versions of the same conversation with a whole lot of separate people when they could actually have them in one place, and we can facilitate the kind of cross-governmental response to the issues that they need to resolve any blockages that they encounter.
Any other views, or shall we move on?
Well, my grey hairs tell you that I've had numerous cases where statutory undertakers have commented on other people's responsibilities, and actually unpicking that can be quite difficult and it can be very unhelpful. So I bang the drum that I ask statutory undertakers to stay in their own lane, please, regularly, and I say that up front. You know, don't be offended. You know, I'll stay in my lane and not tell you how to do your job. Well, maybe, but you know, please do stay. You know, please do stay in your own lane and allow the appropriate authority. Feel free to have a conversation in the background, but you know, if you're putting pen to paper in the public environment, please only comment on your own obligations.
Perfect. We haven't touched on labour and personnel and the sheer volume of people that will be required to help make this happen. And it's a whole other session to talk about skills and training. But where do we think this workforce is going to come from?
An extremely good question, and possibly the biggest of the wicked challenges, certainly for one of the Green Freeports, which is why it's particularly important that the education institutions, Skills Development Scotland, private sector and public sector players in the kind of whole workforce development and skills space are working together. In the case of Inverness and Compty Firth, in what's going to be called the Skills Powerhouse, a slightly different approach being taken in the fourth Green Freeport, but precisely to look upstream at the skills profile needs that will emerge from the early kind of cornerstone investments in the two Green Freeports. That, of course, is part of the attraction, in the case of Inverness and Compty Firth, of the Green Freeport in seeking to do something to arrest and ideally turn in the other direction the experience that we've had of losing people and losing workforce in the Highlands. The question is, what needs to be done to get the right sort of people there, to give them places to live? And the housing issue is, I think, another wicked problem which is going to take quite a lot of effort, and to ensure that they are able to take advantage of the opportunities that the Green Freeports will deliver.
Rosa.
Yeah, there's an interesting sort of dynamic I wanted to raise in the kind of post-COVID world, because obviously within the Freeports context, it's quite sort of desirable from policy perspective that economic growth stays in the area and you encourage people to locate there and you hire local. But then post-COVID, everyone is so much more remote, and a lot of young people will not take a job where you insist that they come to the office 9 to 5 days a week. And obviously it's different when it's construction and boots on the ground, but I think that will be an interesting dynamic to play out and really think about how do you encourage people to come to the area and spend time there, but not rule out people who would otherwise, think a modern working practice no longer works that way. Just throwing that into the challenges.
Fair point.
So we've got 2 minutes left, and again, I'm going to exercise chair discretion here. Lots of different solutions out there. The bit that we haven't really dug into is the different types of ports. And whilst I have enormous respect for Lewis and what he's done at Ardasir and some of the other private sector ports, we have trust ports and we have council-owned ports as well, who simply aren't in a similar position in terms of being able to approach the debt markets and raise the equity, because they're not set up that way. Do you think there's something missing, or do you think there is sufficient support for those types of ports to get to a similar position that the private ports are already doing and underway? That's a really unfair question with 2 minutes to go, but I'm going to start with you, Alistair.
Let's start with me. I thought you might finish with me. I think I don't have any special insights or expertise to offer on this specific point, but I would say something here about clarity and confidence, because one of the essential factors in creating a climate in which investment does flow is clarity about opportunity and confidence in the alignment of those bits of the public sector that have a role to play in standing behind it. And one of the really useful signals, for example, of the SNIB, UKIB announcement was precisely giving confidence that two governments, two policy banks, were standing behind a vision of what Ardasir, the wider Green Freeport and ScotWind deliver. I would suggest that provided that we can generate greater clarity and confidence in the way that the public sector will support development in this area, some of these problems will become somewhat smaller. any further than that, and I will be venturing far out of my expertise. So I will defer to those who can offer a more authoritative view.
Only if you want to. I'm not going to demand that I get a response from each of you, but if you'd like to offer a response, I'd welcome it.
Well, what I would say briefly is that they have to get extremely creative, and there are examples of that. If you look at the Stornoway, you know, the deep water terminal for cruise ships, you know, the financing package that they put together is a consequence of bringing together a lot of intellectual horsepower to try and find a way to solve the problem. So it's going to take definitely an element of creativity. But it's probably going to take an element of doing things a little bit differently. I mean, if you look at continental European ports, a lot of them are owned and operated separately. You know, so there may be something around that type of structure to bring in capital to some of these, you know, publicly owned facilities.
I very much agree with that. And I think there is an importance to be placed in being able to speak the language of finance. Because no matter how compelling the opportunity, if you cannot engage with the sources of debt, the sources of equity which are out there, and make your credit case sufficiently understandable for them, then you're never going to cross that bridge. So you know, where you are perhaps looking at engaging with external finance for the first time, and you don't have that in-house sort of finance raising sophistication, and there's in many cases no reason why the opportunity would. Getting some advisory on board is often money well spent.
Any other views, or are you happy that I draw?
All mine have been taken. All of mine have been said already. So.
Fine. So we have run out of time. We've actually run slightly over time, for which my apologies. Apologies to those who submitted a question that I didn't get to. There was a huge list, and I tried my best to make sure that I chose the ones that I thought would give some really interesting answers. I want to thank you for your attention this afternoon and contributing to the discussion. I hope you found it helpful. It's certainly not the end of the conversation. Everybody on this panel is talking about ports on a daily basis, so there's a lot to do. I'd like to thank all of my panel members for their insights and observations. And finally, if you feel as passionately about this topic and want to continue the conversation, then do get in touch with any of us. If you were unsure about our intent today, then please take this as a formal call to action. Thank you very much.